All right, everyone, welcome back to Course of Action. My guest today is a debut author. He's also a former paramedic and a tactical medic and has a ton of CBRNE and WMD experience that we're going to get into here in a little bit. It's Steve Urzenyi. Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you, Jeff?
I'm good, man. Thank you so much for coming on here. I know you got a busy week of press coming up because the debut book is out in just a handful of days. When people listen to this, it's going to be out today, so go get a copy of Perfect Shot that you see over Steve's left shoulder here in the video. But for sure, go pick it up because it is excellent. I read a NetGalley copy of it earlier this summer, and it just absolutely blew me away. It's a fantastic debut, and we're gonna pick Steve's brain here in a minute about it. But Steve, first, let's talk about kind of you, former paramedic, former tactical medic, which we gotta get the definition of that, and of course, CBRNE and WMD experience, and a lot of incident response, which me and you have in common because I've done some of that too when I was in the military. But what is a tactical medic?
Yeah, so a tactical medic is, and of course the definitions will vary from locale to locale, but generally speaking, North America-wide, a tactical medic is a paramedic that's attached to a police tactical team. And
okay, like
the
SWAT.
purpose of them, yeah, exactly, a SWAT team. So the purpose, and of course there's different levels of tactical. So there's SWAT, there's CBRNE, there's HUSAR, there's some more niche stuff. So there's public order unit medics, which I was as well. So riot squad. I was also on what's called an obstruction removal team, all part of the same Ontario Provincial Police Field Support Bureau special operations, but on multiple teams. And so primarily when people think of a tactical medic, we're thinking SWAT. And it's exactly what you think. It's a SWAT team medic whose job is, depending on the scenario and the type of incident you're responding to, your job is either to hang back in the Tactical Operations Center, the TOC, or the command post, the CP, with one of the commanding officers and wait for a call to move forward if necessary. Or in other scenarios that I've also taken part in, your job is to line up in a stack with the 4, 5, 6, 7 officers going through the door. And normally, as the medic, I'd usually be the second last through the door. Someone behind me watching my back. My job is to watch those in front of me. And the role of a tactical medic primarily is to take care of the officers. So I'm there as a quick response, a QRF really, a quick reaction force, quick response force for the officers. So that if they go through the door and something bad happens, I'm there to help them right away, no delay. Normally, when you think of a paramedic, ambulance, EMTs, they're in most jurisdictions, what should be happening is they should be waiting in a safe distance back, not in the hot zone.
Right, they're on their way.
Not in the line of fire. If a medic gets injured, that's one fewer person to take care of the others.
Yeah, so absolutely.
They're further back in the cold zone, outside the hot zone, whatever you want to call it. And in the case of a tactical medic, we're trained to operate in austere conditions. So in rough situations, rough terrain, less equipment, trained more. A lot of our training and practice is to think fast on our feet. I mean, that's what paramedics do and first responders do every day anyway. But as a tactical medic, it's something you work hard at is, how to intubate somebody while lying on your belly behind a boulder taking fire, things like that. So a tactical medic is there, a forward operating medic, there to take care of the officers right away. Of course, we'll take care of a civilian or we'll take care of the bad guy if need be, but our primary focus is rescuing the officer. So there's an officer down scenario, we can help them right away with, and it's things like tourniquets and rapid application of some pretty quick medical care, basic medical care to save the life. So that's a tactical medic in a nutshell in the SWAT scenario. In CBRNE, it's not much different, depending on how a local CBRNE team or CBRNE team operates. If you're going in on a recce because there's a suspicious package or whatever, then you might go in as part of a stack where it's a multidisciplinary team in CBRNE. You might have a firefighter and a forensic police officer or an ident officer or a CSI type trained officer, right? Who can the job of the firefighter in the front, let's say, would be to identify hazards, carry the gas detection equipment to see if what the atmosphere is like. Because of course, everybody should be in a fully encapsulated level A hazmat suit. So they're detecting any gases in the area, vapors in the area, things that are a danger to the recce team going in. The next person in the stack would usually be the IDEN officer who's looking for evidence, something that indicates the commission of a crime, something that indicates something bad might be about to happen. I mean, everybody's job is to have their eyes open for those things. The third person might be the medic in the stack, again, 3 out of 4, let's say. So, with medical countermeasures in my pocket so that if someone goes down, someone gets a rip in their suit, whatever it is, we can deliver immediate medical care to them and extract them quickly, etc. So the role of the tactical medic will depend on the environment, and the training obviously goes along with that environment.
Yeah.
That was my job.
How long did you do this for?
So I was a tactical medic for 5 years with the OPP. And it was, so out of my career of 30 years, 5 years I was tactical. And it was some of the most fun I had as a medic over those 3 decades. It was just different environment. Again, you're thinking outside the box more. You're always hyper aware. So, as a paramedic, you can get pretty accustomed to treating, routine things. So routine trauma from car accidents, routine heart attacks. Of course, I'll keep routine in air quotes all the way through there because you're doing them so often. They're your bread and butter. You're doing hundreds and thousands of them over the years.
Right.
So falling into being a tactical medic, that was a totally new environment for me to operate in. And most of the time we weren't doing anything, but you were being aware and planning in your mind as well as, during the briefings, of course, we would discuss what might happen and you plan around that. But every step of the way, you're planning for what you might have to do at any given moment.
So how did you get into the CBRNE and WMD side?
That's a good question. So that predates actually my role as a tactical medic. It was something, before even 9/11, I was not sure where I read it or saw it, but I was coming across a lot of literature that talked about, now it wasn't called CBRNE back then, it was NICE, so nuclear, incendiary, chemical, and explosive. There were all kinds of different acronyms over the years, but FEMA developed a course for first responders. And even though I live in Canada, I hooked into this FEMA program and was able to take the course. It was a correspondence course, I guess you'd say, where you got the materials online, you studied online, you took the tests online. So this was back in the 90s that I was doing this. I developed this interest in CBRNE as a way to increase. I love being a medic. I love that whole emergency response side. I loved emergency management, and I love the challenge of always learning new things. And that was a new thing that I thought, if this is something that can harm the public or harm my partners, I want to know about it. I want to know how to mitigate it. I want to know how to deal with it or do something about it. So that was in the 90s I got into that side of it. And it wasn't until I became a tactical medic about 10 years later that I had another opportunity to, as a tactical medic, do a program. It was called the First Responder Training Program, part of a national program here in Canada, part of Public Safety Canada, where they took police officers, paramedics, and firefighters from across the country, brought them all into a location in Ottawa, Ontario, to an emergency management college scenario. And we lived there for 2 weeks and studied intermediate level CBRNE. And that's how I got my first taste. Well, first you did the online basic course, and then you were able to take the in-person intermediate course. And then I then went on to study the advanced course, which takes place on a military base in Alberta, outside Medicine Hat, Alberta, in Suffield, Alberta, called CFB, or Canadian Forces Base Suffield. And that was still is to this day, our WMD base. That's where all the chemical weapon shells are basically buried on this enormous base. And every once in a while they come to the surface, and teams of decontamination experts have to go out and decommission and decontaminate the shells in the area. So that was my introduction to CBRNE as part of the OPP CBRNE program.
Wow. I did some CBRNE stuff in the Air Force, and of course I was a medic. I was more on the medical support side, so I didn't necessarily have my hands on people. I did some of that training, but like they were the last. I was the last one that needed to show up to that. But we built the Alaskan shelters and the temporary hospital. But we did they had a CBRNE one, chemically protected one, where they used these. It looked like Ziploc bags that went on the inside, and they zipped together, and then you had a doorway, and it was pressurized. So then the whole shelter was inflated and had a special filter on it. So you had your chem gear on. You're all suited up. It's supposed to be in a chemically dangerous environment. You walk through the doors that pressurize it. Then you could take it off. You could walk around just like this inside the shelter. And I went out for a week, and I learned this with the Army and with some of my Air Force companions. And we learned how to build this shelter. I already knew how to build an Alaskan shelter, but we learned how to connect it together and do the special liner and how to run the generator and extra filters and all that stuff. Just so if a dirty bomb or a nuclear explosion hit off and there's radiation or whatever, you could still build this facility. It was really, really cool. Unfortunately, I went in the wrong time of the year in South Texas. I went to like July, so I was dying the whole week, but very cool to see. And then it turned on its head. About a year later is when they had the Ebola scare down in Dallas. And I was on the team that knew how to build all that. And they were like, the general was like, we're going to Dallas. And 72-hour notice. And I was just sitting there waiting. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe of all the places, I'm going to go to Dallas, Texas and deal with Ebola. Like, oh man. But yeah, it's crazy how we plan and prepare for some of those things, hoping that it never happens.
Exactly. Yeah. My last 5 years, I was the commander of a team in Ontario called the Ontario Emergency Medical Assistance Team. And that is the province of Ontario's disaster medical response and all hazards incident management team. One of our specialties, one of the things we were tasked with from a legislative standpoint was CBRNE response. And so we had those, so we had a full setup of multiple tents, right? The canvas style tents that go up on frames. Some of the ones we got later were, they had air, pressure supports as beams, so air pressure beams really. But our CBRNE unit was a negative pressure, positive pressure capable unit where you zipped in that lining.
Yeah.
And we trained in those units to decon patients and treat patients in those units. And the job of EMAT, so unlike being a tactical medic or a frontline paramedic, the job of EMAT would be to send in, just like your role with that medical decon and isolation facility that you're talking about. Our role was secondary, to roll in after the fact, usually within 12 to 24 hours.
Okay, yeah. That's what we had. We had multiple teams. I was on the first team that went in with the gear. We started setting up. The second team was supposed to roll in like 12 hours later after we had like at least one or two tents set up and connected with the airlock. And then they rolled in, and then the actual medic team rolled in a third wave. And within like 24 hours, we're supposed to be up and running with like 8 tents, fully ready to go, start triaging people. And it felt impossible, but the more we did it, the more it was like, okay, I guess
and that's what we trained for. And again, jumping forward to EMAT versus my medic roles, we trained I held multiple training sessions a year. The focus of that and the focus of the team was about scalability. So, we can respond to a small incident. And I'll give you an example. There was we're aware of harm reduction teams and safe injection sites and those types of things. Well, there was an incident going on in Toronto, more of a political situation with a pop-up harm reduction site. And the government, because our team represented the government, our team was called in to assist and set up essentially a logistical support area for the harm reduction team and the safe injection site, while in the background, the public health people and the political people figured out what they were going to do to provide a more permanent solution or go whatever way they were going to go. So on a scalable level, that was a very small situation. Whereas if you expand that, we've provided entire field hospitals to support major incidents. But fast forward to the pandemic, and we were the first team in Canada deployed to set up quarantine or isolation facilities for Canadians returning from abroad, those returning directly from China, and later those returning from cruise ships. Or I might have the timings reversed, but either way. So we set up medical isolation facilities. So they stayed in quarters on a military base or a government facility. We set up a medical, a full isolation medical facility where someone who, and of course we knew nothing about COVID back then. Really, we still were thinking it wasn't, we thought it was airborne and not contact droplets and all these other things we didn't know, or reverse that. We thought it was all contact as opposed to airborne. And we won't get into all that, but you learn as you go. And we went to the maximum level of protection we could provide, or almost. We didn't go into level A suits, but we had the negative pressure, we had the medical filtration, the air filtration, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because it was such an unknown thing, and we had to reduce and mitigate the risk as much as possible. So that's what you do. And of course, that's why you count on your training, and you hope that the whole team is prepared to, again, go in, provide a scalable response, and do what you need to do.
I think that was one of the most shocking and realizing things that I did on active duty was when we did all that training, and then they're like, don't worry about your hazmat suits and your decon suits and all that. Well, if we ever have to do that one day, we'll get fitted right before we got to go, because we had a 72-hour window, mind you. So 72 hours to get on a plane and get out of there. So when the stuff in Dallas kicked off, and they thought they had that Ebola scare, and people were responding to it, and the Air Force was like, we're going to send this team in. We're going to do it. We're going to set it up. And they called us into a conference room there in the hospital. And we're like, okay, guys, we're going to get set up for our hazmat suits. And I was like, oh, man, this is real. This is real. I had the white suit on with the duct tape around the wrists and everything. And I was like, oh, wow, this is we might actually be going. I had to go home and tell my wife. And I was like, they had Ebola scare down in Dallas. I might be going to handle that. And she was like, you, of all people? I was like, I know, right? I'm shocked too. But it was, it's real how we train for that. And you have a ton of experience. How did you get into writing? When was the kind of the moment for Steve that said, you know what? I'm going to take a shot at writing something.
Yeah, I've had an interest in writing my entire life. I mean, as a kid, I wrote stories. I think I got addicted to writing when one of the stories I wrote, it was called Mr. Muggs Gets Kidnapped. And it was a sequel, or it was a homage. What do we call it? Fanfic kind of piece for an existing series about Mr. Muggs, which was, I think he was an Old English sheepdog or something.
Okay.
But the story I wrote was called Mr. Muggs Gets Kidnapped. And it was grade 3, I think it was. And my grade 3 teacher loved it, and the principal loved it, and they hung it up in the school. And it was like, wow, that's almost like my dad's books at home on the bookshelf, where my story is hanging in the school. So I think that was probably my first taste of really brushing up against the fame model of writing.
Yeah.
And from that point on, I continued to write. I liked writing. I even mocked up books with, the title on the cover, and I even wrote the name of the press. So, Ryerson University Press or whatever on the bottom. But I had a story called Ocean Trek. So it was, it was a ripoff of Star Trek back in the 60s and 70s, but it was about a submarine dealing with, a giant squid or whatever the story was. So, it goes back to the age of 8 or 9 or 10 when I really got hooked on it. And then so I dabbled in writing through the years, and I actually tried to write a novel back in the 90s. But I hit a wall in the 90s because when I got to a point, I was pantsing. I wasn't outlining. I'm still a pantser to this day. But back then I came up against a wall, and I didn't know where to go with my story. And the internet being what it was in its infancy at the time, you really couldn't figure out how people dealt with hitting roadblocks or writer's block, or
you had to know them and talk to them.
You had to know them and talk to them, or you go to a library, or you go to a bookstore and find a book. But every book talked about, if you're not, every book I found kept saying, if you're not outlining, you're not a writer. And that discouraged me. I dropped what I was doing. I laid it down. I didn't pick it back up. So I left that alone. Life continued because I'm raising kids and working away, paying a mortgage, all those things you do as an adult. And years later, I became a tactical medic. Well, actually, in that same time frame, I started writing for a magazine, a Canadian paramedic magazine, a national magazine, came out, and I was interested in it. I pitched a column to them about kind of a medic Steve's Corner, which is what it ended up being called. And I had my run of providing writing about whatever topic I wanted, just a roughly 1,200, 1,500 word column. Every issue, it was a bi-monthly magazine, 6 times a year. So I would write a column for this magazine for 3 years.
Wow.
And that helped me perfect my craft and get more interested. And then I came across a TV show that was running at the time called Flashpoint. And it was a Canadian TV show about tactical cops. It was shot and filmed up here, ostensibly kind of took place up here, but they never said Toronto. They never said what city, but you know, you had to presume where it might be. And I pitched them the idea, the producers and the writers, the creators of the show and the showrunners, about the role of a tactical medic and what they do and how that might work on the show. And very polite in the writer's room, they heard my story, and basically they made the decision not to go with a tactical medic for dramatic reasons, that they didn't want to put a medic on the team. They felt it might reduce the tension of the story if someone gets hurt and there's a medic standing right behind them who can save them, so to speak. But
Sure.
I did mention at the time that I enjoyed writing, and they basically said, well, why aren't you writing? And I gave my little story, and the best advice to this day I've ever had is the people in that room, the writers, just said to me, Steve, if you want to write, just write. And it was from that moment on, so around 2010 or so, that I picked things back up and I wrote a few screenplays, or terrible screenplays. And one of those screenplays morphed into the beginnings of the Alex Martel series. And really, that's what, almost 10 years ago, that's where it all started, leading us up to where we are today, really. So
I think it's cool that you wrote a column. I was going to ask you, like, have you ever thought about writing about some of your expertise? But obviously you did a column on it. Have you ever thought about expanding outside of that, or doing a little bit more over maybe in nonfiction?
Yeah, I have thought about that. And it appeals to me, but at the same time, it's such a discipline to write. I read academic magazines quite a bit, whether it's, sort of current events, or whether it's medical based, whether that's, again, pre-hospital medicine, so paramedic stuff, or critical care medicine, the hospital stuff. And the one thing that's very clear is how much research, how it's a very, very specified or specific form of writing, with obviously citations and research. And so it appealed to me from the standpoint of I'd love to share some of the knowledge I have, but at the same time, it's not, I know guys who write articles for journals, medical journals, and great guys, great writers, but it's not a style of writing that I'm drawn to. So it's why I never pursued it. I don't think I'd be good at it. Too disciplined. Again, I'm a pantser. Right?
Yeah.
It's hard to be a pantser when you're writing an article about medicine.
So as you started, flashing back to 2010, you started writing a little more seriously, really saying, I'm going to do this. How did you start off? Did you start off as an outliner and then evolve into a pantser? Tell us a little bit about your evolution into a writer before the publishing deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, from then till now, nothing's changed in the way I start a story. And that is that I picture a scene. I picture a person, I picture a moment, a snapshot. And it could be because I'm a photographer as well. I've been, shooting
that's got to help.
Since I was a kid. Yeah, so I see things very visually.
It makes the first chapters of your book make so much sense from you saying that, because it's so, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's so descriptive, and I could just see it in my head, so it makes sense.
Well, when we jump forward to it, I'll talk a bit more about that, but that scene, that's what I had in my head. Not the whole scene, but the picture of Alex lying in a forest in a ghillie suit with a sniper rifle. And the only question I have at that point is, what is she seeing? What is she doing? Why is she there? And the story takes off from there. I don't know where it's going to go, but the story takes off from there. So, but to back up, back when I started writing a few screenplays and even a pilot TV series that I wrote. I wrote the pilot, but it was junk, and it didn't go anywhere, and it shouldn't have gone anywhere. Exactly. It's, you're practicing. Like anything else, you've got to start by making ugly things, and hopefully one day you make a beautiful thing.
Yes.
And so I pictured this character or these characters, and I just started writing. And I would write. Sometimes I would start writing with a male character. Usually I would start with writing with a male character, but they would just not go anywhere. So I would write with a male character, and I would, in my head, I'd have maybe the voice of a hard-boiled detective story, and I would write, some gumshoe kind of story, and I would go 5-6 pages in. It would sound good, but it would go nowhere. And then I would try something else and try something else. And then one day, and I didn't know it at the time, but one day I started writing about this female Interpol investigator in the Netherlands. She was in Amsterdam, not The Hague, but in the Netherlands. And her name was Rachel Danaher. And I was writing about Rachel, and she comes across these other guys, and this whole story around that. And that didn't go anywhere either. But it's all practice. It's all picturing things in your head, kind of getting an idea where you're going. And then in time, I started to write a screenplay where she wasn't even in it yet. What it turned out to be the backstory to the first Alex Martel story I wrote. So I was writing about, the scene started, it was a Christmas Eve in Sarajevo during the siege of Sarajevo back in the mid-90s.
Oh, wow. And
I pictured this little boy and this little girl around the Christmas tree with their parents, sort of the first year of the siege of Sarajevo. So I think that was, I'm going to get it wrong now. It was 92 or 93, I believe 93, that Christmas. And then later, something happens to their parents, and they grow up to avenge their parents' death. And you probably recall, there were, the sniper alley in Sarajevo. So many people were civilians were killed by snipers in what was deemed or dubbed Sniper Alley in Sarajevo. And that's just people trying to go get water, trying to go get firewood, and risking their lives out in the street just to have their everyday life.
Yeah, it's dangerous.
Go on. Yeah. But that bud of an idea formed in my head, and I wrote that. And then this brother-sister duo, the brother started taking out Serbian generals across Europe. He became a sniper, and he was shooting former Serbian snipers that had been, fought in the siege of Sarajevo, or took part in the siege. And my character that grew out of that to chase these guys down was Alex Martel, who grew out of that, the Amsterdam, the Rachel Danaher kind of model. And that's where it all started. So I got maybe 30 pages into the screenplay and thought, I like the story, but I want to make it a long form. And I switched it to a novel form, and it took off from there. And that was the beginning of the first version of an Alex Martel story.
When I started writing fiction, I tried really, really hard to be an outline guy. Really disciplined outline, chapter by chapter, scene by scene, even throwing in some dialogue in there that I was thinking about. And I just realized the book I have now that I'm done with, that I'm working on submissions for, I've probably rewrote it 5 times, just because every time it was like, this isn't working, that's not working. And I found myself scrapping stuff. And instead of trying to come up with something to replace it, it was like, let's review some chapters. Let's review the story. Let's kind of put the story. I have a whiteboard off to the side over here, and it's really just got scenes and major points in it. And then after that, you're just filling in the gaps with things. And I've met so many authors like you, and I've talked to so many people on this podcast and at BoucherCon and Thriller Fest, and almost all of them say they're pantsers. The only one who said he's a hardcore outliner is Kyle Mills. Everybody else is a bit of a pantser, and I think for Kyle, a major 20,000 word outline, it just works for him and his process. But everybody else seems to be a pantser to some degree, whether it's really, really loose or very, very disciplined in that, definition of pantser. But I found myself to be a lot more, and I think I do better work when I'm more relaxed and I'm not trying to stick to such a disciplined and rigorous, it almost like it stifles creativity.
Yeah, and it's as I move on to the next book. So I've handed in the second book already in the Alex Martel story series, and now I'm starting to work on the third one. Now, overall, not to confuse anybody, that'll be number 4 that I'm writing. The first one, nothing has happened with that. Nothing ever will happen. It just won't see the light of day. That was my thesis, the way I look at it, my, you know, perfecting my craft story. So
Yeah.
as I've gone from book to book, I have incorporated more outlining in my process. So I still start the same way. I still start with the view of what I'm looking at, put Alex in a scene and what happens. But I'm also trying to look a little further down the road, not to know the entire story, but to maybe visualize, the flag in the distance.
Mm-hmm.
Can I see a spot on the horizon that I'm aiming for? I don't know yet what route I'm going to take to get there, but where are the goalposts? Is there a goalpost, or is it just still blurry? So I aim now to start to know sooner in my writing where I'm going. But it's still a pantser process. I don't know what I'm going to write on any given day, and any given day can take me totally in a new direction. And of course, non-writers won't understand the phrase, and I think they think we're all crazy, but you have to let the characters dictate where they want to go as well.
1,000%.
And it's so true, because yes, it comes out of our minds. They're a product of our imagination, but ultimately something they do in a scene, that's something you spontaneously write, because suddenly you have a whim and it's like, oh, great idea, and you write that, and now it takes the story and the characters in a completely new direction, and they do take on a life of their own and drag you along, maybe kicking and screaming. I actually watched Tess Gerritsen in an interview recently. Actually, today I was watching part of an interview with Tess Gerritsen, who, of course, is the Rizzoli and Isles creator and multiple series, and she's got a new series now. But she too is a pantser, and says that she would be lost if she wasn't listening to her characters tell her where to go. And I find that so true. So I could never be like Kyle Mills and a pure outliner, but I'm kind of moving a little more that direction, just to try to be a little more organized and take a little less time, and maybe in the end have a little less revision work for me to do. Although that probably won't be the case.
I know so
Writing
many
is
people.
editing.
Yeah, so many people have said the first book you have all the time in the world to write, but it's the second, third, and progressive books, like, then you have a deadline. So then things are a little different after that, because you don't get a kickback and let the juices flow and things come to you. It's a little different. So I can see where becoming a little bit more of an outliner becomes a necessity to a degree, because you really got to get, and I think Mark Greaney does it really well. I think he's still a bit of a pantser, a little bit of outliner, but I think Mark has so much stuff in his head that he already knows where it's going.
Yeah.
And he can kind of guide, Court Gentry and the rest of the characters just as much as they guide him. But I think he's so in touch with it. I mean, like 13 books down now, So I think that is a maturation of being an author, is you begin to learn yourself, learn the book and the characters you're writing, and it's kind of a give and take.
Yeah, and it's like anything. It's like sport, for instance. I'm a big hockey fan. I love hockey, ice hockey. I used to play hockey for many years, and I was back into some just before the pandemic. I was playing, adult league hockey again, or really pickup hockey. But it's you picture the same thing. It's a pro hockey player, a Wayne Gretzky, Austin Matthews, whoever you pick. You pick the big names in the game today. It's the Sidney Crosbys.
Mm-hmm.
They don't think about it. They don't even look at the ice. They just know where things are happening. They know how plays. They can see plays developing before they develop.
Yeah.
And it's the same with a writer. And not myself. You're using Mark Rainey as an example, and that's, I think, how Mark must handle it. It's like he just knows instinctively. I mean, it's taken a lot of work. But all that foundation of the 12 or 13 books he's written before is just sitting there below the surface. It just helps to kick up ideas, and he knows instinctively. People who write a lot and have got a lot of books behind them, Brad Taylor's, anyone like that, they know from trial and error what's worked for them in the past and what hasn't worked, and maybe they'll go down this road, but they will also recognize sooner than us newer people, us newer writers, I've been down that road. It led me to a dead end, or it took me on a turn I didn't want to make. So I'm not going down that road. I'll go down this one, because the last time I did this one, it worked. And it's not that they're writing the same thing, but they have an idea. They're knowing what direction they're going in, and it's, not into the fire, but away from it. So I think that has a lot to do with it.
I think, and we're going to talk about Perfect Shot here in a minute, but I interviewed Brad Thor this summer, and we were talking about the difference between Rising Tiger, his last book, and Deadfall, his current one. And I made a comment, and it was like, I felt like this moved really quickly. And he was like, it did. But he's like, let me tell you something. And I think he was like, Rising Tiger had more chapters and more pages than Deadfall did. And I was like, it really felt like a longer book, but it just moved faster. He's like, no, you're completely wrong. Don't hold me to that. I don't remember if that's exactly what it was, but there was a distinct difference between the two that I didn't even notice. And I think that's just a sign of somebody very seasoned, where it's like, I didn't show you this as the reader, but I had 20 more chapters in the last book than I did in this book. But you think this one's longer, and it's like, oh, that's just, I think that is experience.
Yeah. And Brad Thor is one of my absolute favorites.
Oh, me
writing
too.
Right now.
I thought he was going to say no when I offered him to come on, and he was like a resounding yes. Loved it. And I was like, wow, he's a rock star in my eyes. I'll be forever in his debt, because he sent me a book too, and I was like, hey, this is awesome. I can shut the podcast down now and never do another one again.
Mic drop.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's I mean, I met him once. I talked to him this past summer at Thriller Fest. Seems like a nice guy and very giving of his time. I've seen him on podcasts, and his writing he's at the top of his game. I don't think anybody out there is better right now, or maybe one or two in the same kind of level, but he's just right at the top of his form.
So let's talk about you right now. You're kind of at your top of your game right now. Debut book is about to come out, Perfect Shot. So let's kind of flash forward. You got the publishing deal. Okay, now you're looking at Perfect Shot and saying, I got to perfect this, essentially, and hand it in. What is Steve's emotions? What's going through your head now that you got the deal and it's real and you're about to see a cover and all that?
Oh, it was so surreal. I mean, it was really kind of a mind-blowing experience. I think I never caught up in a way to the experience of it. Mm-hmm. It just seemed always so surreal that it didn't seem real. I mean, that's what surreal means, but just never felt real. So, when I was offered the deal and when I signed the contract, it was just really mind-blowing. So exciting. I'm not 20, I'm not 30. I turned 61 this past September. And like I said earlier, I've been a fan of writing, and I've had a love for writing all my life. So to have this happen now, it's just cool. It just feels great to know that, there's a book that's going to be out there, and I've seen it now, I've touched it, I felt it. It's just a really exciting time right now.
What was it like signing the first book? You finally put the Sharpie down on a piece of paper to a real book.
I thought, who is this? I had the total imposter syndrome. Yeah. Like, what am I doing signing a book? Like, that's so pretentious of me, to pick up a book and sign my name and my book with my name on it and give it to somebody. Yeah, it was, that was the ARCs. The first time I did that, actually it was before the ARCs, because I received some copies of what they call the bound manuscript. So it was really my raw manuscript bound. I mean, if I can jump off camera for 1 second.
Sure.
You can edit this after. This is so what I'm talking about, this is the bound manuscript. So the original title was Render Safe. And we won't go into that necessarily unless you want to, but it's really just the manuscript that I turned in, bound into
a book,
a soft cover book. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was the bound manuscript, uncorrected manuscript raw. So there was that. So I actually, for a couple of friends and family members, I did sign a couple of copies of these. So these will be worth trillions of dollars.
Yeah,
in the near
that was
future.
Priceless.
And then the next thing that came along, of course, was the ARC. And it was when I started signing these and sending them out that it felt strange. I felt like an imposter. It's one thing to sign something for your family in a way, it's like signing a Christmas card. It's like, here you go. It
Yeah.
didn't feel that special. But when I'm signing something like this,
Yeah.
that's going to fellow writers or other people that I was saying thank you to at the time, that's when it hit me that this is weird. Like, this is what I do now.
Mm-hmm.
I write, and people actually want a signed version of what I write. It's again, surreal is probably an overused term, but it just didn't quite feel real. But it felt really good.
So what has things been like in the last 6 months since Thriller Fest when me and you met and chatted for a few? You got the arcs, you got the final version, you started getting the hardcovers in, and now, of course, people who are listening to this right now it's out, but we're recording a couple of days ahead of time.
Mhm.
What's the last 6 months leading up to this next couple of days felt like?
Well, the interesting thing, and you touched on it earlier, is you have your entire life to write that first book, as much time as you need. But Perfect Shot was the first book, and I had a deadline to get the second one in. So part of the last 6 months since Thriller Fest, for instance, was finishing that second book. And I talked to a lot of writer friends, commiserating with them about why is the second one so hard to finish. But I was reassured by many of them, if not all of them, that the second book that they had under contract was probably the hardest writing they ever had to do. And that was my experience. So a lot of the time that I might have been thinking ahead to publication day and how great that'll be, and I was doing that, of course, a lot of that time was stressing over getting that second manuscript finished and in. And part of that was I got the book deal off of Perfect Shot. I knew someone already liked Perfect Shot. I knew people who were reading it were enjoying it. But was that a one-off? So there's all this self-doubt that creeps in. You don't think it's going to creep in,
Right.
but it finds a way in. And I think that had a lot to do with why I found it so hard to finish the second book, the sophomore novel, as it were. Just a lot of self-doubt and wondering, is this story good enough? Is it going to meet the bar I've set for myself with Perfect Shot? So there was that aspect of it. I had that to finish. And I finally got that finished and turned in. I was very happy about that. But then the rest of it has been a whirlwind. I mean, there's lots of little things happening on the way. And, you try to let things take care of themselves, but every author has to be their own marketing firm as well. So the publishers are awesome and they do things for you. They position things out there with, reviewers, and they do Goodreads giveaways, and they do all the things they need to do. They put it in the hands of people who need to see it and maybe can put the word out. But it still comes down to the author to toot their own horn to a certain extent, to draw attention to their work, to get the landscape prepared for the coming of their book. Now that sounds awfully. There's a terrible expression that sounded way too pretentious, but you're trying to lay the groundwork for the arrival of your baby. And you have to do that because otherwise you've been working on this your whole life for nothing. You got to make sure people are going to see it. You got to try to build a following. You've got to network. I mean, that's what we do with Thriller Fest and VoucherCon is we meet other writers. We meet people who we can share stories about and talk writing about. But ultimately, we know we're going to have each other's back during the game, right? We're going to amplify each other's messages and share each other's stories and successes and whatever else. So there's been that whole aspect that the marketing side, I guess, is what I'm talking about. I didn't expect that to be as time consuming as it has been.
Yeah.
And it really has taken up a lot of time. Now, I'm not complaining about that. It's just the nature of the beast like anything else, but that's been a bit of an eye opener. So it takes much more discipline on my part now to drag myself away from social media and get my head back in the game and writing again. Yeah. And, it's been difficult because the last couple of weeks, especially, have been a bit of a whirlwind with different things happening and, a couple of launch events planned. So trying to think writing is almost impossible, but you've got to do it. Like any other job or discipline, you've got to get your head back in the game. So it's been fantastic, but it's also been very distracting.
Yeah.
at the
So
same time.
give us the 30-second spiel on Perfect Shot, your debut book, without spoiler free.
Okay, spoiler free. Perfect Shot. So Perfect Shot is a story of FBI Special Agent Alexander Martel. Alex is stationed, she's an FBI agent, formerly a combat medic and a sniper. Then she left the armed forces, the Army in particular, to go work for the FBI. She's stationed in The Hague, and she gets a disturbing note about something that's happened to a friend of hers. And while investigating that, she stumbles on a bigger threat that has more global implications. So that's probably the 30-second overview, that unrehearsed, unpracticed.
That's good. That's good. That's pretty spot on without giving too much away. I can say that there's a kind of a shootout helicopter scene there at the beginning that and I said this earlier, that when you said you were a photographer, I was like, oh, it makes sense now, because the way you wrote this scene, I felt like I was in a helicopter too. I felt like I was right there. I had the different looks from on the ground. Like, it was so clean and so descriptive that, like, I felt like I was either there or I was watching it on TV as it was happening. So it was excellent. And if I could plug the book based off of that, like, you gotta buy the book just to read this scene, because it's just fantastic in the way it's descriptive of the environment, of how the helicopter's flying, the things that she's dealing with, trying to aim a rifle. Like, it's all spot on.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And a couple of things come to mind with that scene. One is that I do think cinematically. So when I'm writing,
It makes sense.
I don't know how other writers do it, but I'm picturing a movie.
Yeah.
So if I'm writing a book, I'm not writing a movie, but in my mind, it's unfolding as if I were watching the movie myself for the first time. So that's the first thing, number one. Number two, I love that scene too. And it started again with that idea of Alex lying in the woods in a ghillie suit holding her sniper rifle. Mm-hmm. And we find out, as you know, that they're there to interdict some bad stuff, a transaction between gangs that's going on that she's taken part in. But as it evolves, I kept thinking of some advice that another writer, Joshua Hood, you probably know Josh. Josh has written books, The Treadstone Resurrection, and other books in the Treadstone series. And I was talking to Josh a few years back, and I think he said this on podcasts, I'm sure, and other places, but Josh is fantastic at writing action. He's probably one of the best action and fight writing guys out there.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
His advice was, if you can't think of anything else to do, have someone pull a gun or shoot somebody, or have your bad guy shoot somebody, or have your good guy shoot somebody. Or as the other wisdom goes, put them up a tree and then throw rocks at. Put your hero up a tree and throw rocks at them. So all the way through that scene with Alex in the helicopter, etc., I was imagining basically having her up in a tree and throwing rocks at her and making her have to deal with whatever was coming her way. So I enjoyed writing that opening sequence very much.
Yeah, I love that opening sequence big time. Like, it was excellent. So, global threat she uncovers, fantastic debut. Let me ask you this. Spoiler free, where is the second, third, and continuance of the series looking like for Steve?
Okay, so without spoilers, let's see. So, I think the strength of Perfect Shot is the character of Alex. She's a smart, tough, capable female protagonist. So that doesn't change in terms of she's still sassy. She's still, quick-witted, dry humor. She's still somewhat irreverent when it comes to authority. She turns her nose up a bit at authority, and she likes to carve her own path, shall we say. So that's not going to change. She's still going to do those things. In the second book in the series, it's still largely internationally set. There's some more domestic scenes in the second book. As you know, the first book, was there anything in the U.S.? I'm not sure anything was in the United States.
I don't think so.
Pretty much nothing. I think, other than references to maybe FBI headquarters, things like that, the story was not set in the U.S. at all. It was all set in Europe and Turkey and Russia and England. The second book, there's more. Alex comes home for a bit, shall we say, but it's still an international thriller. Things take place internationally that she responds to and goes to deal with. So I won't say much more than that, but I think fans of Perfect Shot will absolutely be fans of the second book. And some of the same, again, not to give too much away, but some of the same cast of characters that appeared in Perfect Shot will be rejoining the circus in book 2.
Nice. And that's turned in. So now you're working on book 3. The debut is about to come out, and you're just writing away, man. And I think it's so awesome. I love Perfect Shot. Everybody needs to go get their copy of it. It's out now. Steve is a guy to follow for sure. And Steve, before I let you go, tell people where they can go find more so they can tune in and see what's in store for Alex.
Absolutely. So my website is steveurzeny.com. So my first name, last name.com. They'll be able to see it on the screen. It would be too long. It would take up the entire additional podcast for me to spell my name. But steveurzeny.com is my website. I will be starting to do a better job of updating that and having more information out there. But right now, there's information about Perfect Shot there, and soon there'll be information. Once I get my notes back from my editor at Minotaur Books, and we start really getting into the editing of the second book, that's when more will appear on my website about the second book. But until I've got the notes processed from my editor and we know exactly which direction we're going to go, because of course everything's in flux for the first few months of editing, it'll be a bit of a mystery, but that'll go up online as well. And follow me on social media. Again, it's usually Steve Urzeny on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram and Facebook as well.
So, one last question, I guess, now that you mentioned it. Are you going to be on a yearly release schedule, you think, or is it going to be a little more accelerated?
Oh, accelerated, I doubt it. Right now, it's a yearly release. Okay. My contract with my publisher is currently up in terms of, it was a 2-book deal. I've submitted 2 books. Of course, we need to finish working on the second one together. But the third one, essentially, I'm writing on spec, hoping that, at some point in the next few months, my publisher will tap me on the shoulder and say, we really love where the series has gone and we want you to keep writing it. So if all goes well, then I imagine it'll be a continual 1-year, 12-month kind of schedule. It looks like every fall right now. And I'd love to, I've toyed with the idea of some other projects, and people have asked me periodically, to maybe think about some collaborations, but I've got my hands full right now. And if I could figure out a way to make more time or to write faster, I'll maybe consider it. But right now, it's just going to be one project a year, at least one large project a year. And we'll see if the smaller ones fill in those spaces at all.
Well, I have no doubt that you will be in store for many books to come with Alex. Perfect Shot is fantastic. It is out right now. You should go get it. You should then mail it to Steve and have him autograph it, because it's going to be worth $1 billion. It's a fantastic debut. Steve, thank you so much for coming on, brother. It was good to see you at Thriller Fest. I hope to see you again next year at one of the conferences. I'm not sure exactly which ones I'm going to go to yet, but I hope to see you then, and absolutely good luck on the debut.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to your listeners and watchers, your viewers. I've had a blast. I'm having a blast. And I'm happy if anyone drops me a line and asks me a question anytime. But thanks so much, Jeff. And we will definitely see you around.